G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here to examine the Fractal Furphies. Here we have an example of the closure of the fractal loop. The most contemporary recent fractal Furphy is that all water carts were called Furphies. That part of it's true. That a horse-drawn water cart was a most famous implement in World War I to carry water to the Australian Imperial Forces at either Gallipoli or in Egypt or in France. This story first floated in the 1970s and it became entrenched to the point where you'd hear it on ABC radio talkback in the weekday afternoons during the 1990s when Johnny Howard was taking Australia to war in Afghanistan. And he wanted to expand Australia's warlike expeditions to Iraq, and he pretty much bankrolled a resurgence in the military memorabilia industry in Australia. And this story about a Furphy means a baseless rumour, and it was called a baseless rumour in the army because during the First World War the soldiers told rumours around the back of the Furphy water cart took a hold. And I'll be honest with you, during the Second World War, the Second Australian Imperial Forces did regard the word Furphy as being synonymous with baseless rumour and bullshit. But that was for a reason. We'll get onto that reason somewhat later. But here we have a water cart, colloquially known as a Furphy because it was a water cart, and they were known as Furphies because in the 1880s and 1890s and into the early 1900s, in Shepparton, in Victoria, Joseph Furphy's big brother had a foundry, and in that foundry he made water carts. The Furphy water cart had an elliptical section water tank, as opposed to the circular cylindrical section tank built by T. Hicks, engineer and iron founder in Mascot in Sydney. The elliptical section Furphies were considered to be a superior form of a water cart to anything with a circular tank because the elliptical tank had a lower vertical profile, it had a lower centre of gravity, it could carry pretty much the same, roughly a tonne of water, maybe a tonne and a half, but it could carry it lower down over the axle so it was less likely to tip over on rough ground or while traversing slopes and inclines. So the Furphy water tank was the best water tank, the best water cart going in Australia in the 1880s, 1890s, before the First World War. So I think it's fair to say that right up until 1903, the term Furphy in Australia meant water cart, and it only meant water cart. However, in 1897, Joseph Furphy sent a manuscript of his book, Such is Life, to the editor of the Bulletin. And the editor of the Bulletin, A.G. Stevens, then editor of the Bulletin's book publications, wrote to Furphy, quote, rather long-winded, and yet such is life is good. It seems to me fitted to become an Australian classic or semi-classic, which takes the form of 7 chapters, each chapter being an expanded diary entry of one day in the week, and the days of the week are 1 year apart, so you get a 7-day, 7-year snapshot of life in Australia through the eyes of Joseph Furphy, who had been in his day a farmer who went broke during a drought and a bullock drover whose animals died of cattle disease and he went broke doing that. And then in 1896 or 1897 he went to work in his brother's foundry, and that's when he started writing his book. And the very first chapter is titled Unemployed, and it begins chapter 1, Unemployed at last! Exclamation mark. Scientifically, such a contingency can never have befallen of itself. According to one theory of the universe, the momentum of original impress has been tending toward this far-off divine event ever since a scrap of fire mist flew from the solar centre to form our planet. Not this event alone, of course, but every occurrence, past and present, from the fall of captured Troy to the fall of a captured insect. According to another theory, I hold an independent diploma as one of the architects of our social system, with a commission to use my own judgment and take my own risks, like any other unit of humanity. This theory, unlike the first, entails frequent hitches and cross purposes, and to some malign operation of these I should owe my present holiday. Okay, unemployed at last, and he's happy about it. He's happy about being unemployed because it gives him the time and the leisure to write his book. Now, that was a sentiment that people could swallow in the golden halcyon days before the First World War, which is when the book came out. There are only 1,170 or something copies of it. It wasn't reprinted even in abridged form till 1937, and then it was reprinted again in its whole unabridged form in 1944. But I have to say, it's an intensely complicated book. The plot has multiple subplots and twists and segues and diversions and distractions. And it's not until you get to the very end of the last chapter that you begin to understand what half the stuff in the first chapter was about. You really need to read the book 3 to 5 times to get the full flavour of it. And not to put too fine a point on it, the generation of Australians, the males anyway, the men of Australia who were educated to the point where they enjoyed reading long, complicated sentence structure full of big words, they died in the First World War. And in the 1930s, anything that saw good in being unemployed when 30% of the population had no work was highly frowned on. Okay, so by the 1940s, when the second AIF was talking about rumours, a Furphy was a bullshit story because being unemployed was bullshit. There were people who were older than that and they understood that a Furphy was a long, complicated moral story with a really important point at the end of it, but you had to get through all the segues to get to the point. And that's why as late as the 1960s, there were still teachers wagging their finger at students and saying, I'll have none of your Furphies now, just tell me yes or no. A Furphy was a long, complicated story because Joseph Furphy wrote Such Is Life, which is a long, complicated story. In wartime, soldiers do make up rumours and they tell them to each other, and they may well have told them around the back of a Furphy watercart, looking something like this but oval. But of one fact we can be absolutely certain, and that is that the Australian Imperial Forces in the First World War took no watercarts with them overseas. They certainly never took Furphy watercarts to Gallipoli, to Egypt or to Palestine. And if any AIF veterans remember telling rumours around the back of the Furphy, it would have been at Puckapunyal training camp. It would have been at training camps on the east coast of Australia. That is a picture of Anzac Cove while the Australians were there trying to run up those hills into machine gun fire and rifle fire and against hand grenades and maybe a few mortars and artillery shells. Not really the kind of country where you can take a Furphy, a horse-drawn water cart. It's just, sorry, the idea that a Furphy is a rumour told around the water cart at Gallipoli in the First World War, around the water cart in Egypt in the First World War, around the water cart, the Furphy water cart made in Shepparton and taken to France. That is a completely baseless rumour about a Furphy, so technically it proves that a Furphy is a baseless rumour. So you've got your Fractal Furphy. A Furphy is a bullshit rumour in World War II. The idea that a Furphy water cart accompanied the AIF in World War I into combat is a bullshit rumour from, well, the Iraq War, or was it the Vietnam War? It was a home front rumour that was cooked up as the World War I veterans were dying out. It was a Furphy. But a Furphy, an original Furphy was a water cart, and an original Furphy was a long, complicated moral tale with lots of segues, and you won't understand it until you get to the end, and then you're probably going to have to listen to it all over again to make sure you got all the segues and the side tracks and the ambiance, the vibe of the thing straight in your head before you understand what's going on. Therefore, the Fractal Furphy Furphies. And of course, those who really want to get in on the detail may even be already aware of the fact that Tom Collins was the pen name that Joseph Furphy used to use when submitting his short stories to the Bulletin from 1895 to 1905 or something. Yep. Those of you who've got an even broad grasp of Australian bushranger history will be fully aware that Such Is Life was the one-line quote attributed to Ned Kelly just as they hanged him. Ned Kelly is also perhaps apocryphally known for saying that the beginnings of wisdom comes when you learn never to argue with a policeman, because if you argue with a policeman and win fair and square, then he'll want to fight with you, and if you fight with a policeman and you win the fight fair and square, then he'll try to kill you, and if you kill a policeman, it's as bad as killing a blowfly, because a dozen of his mates are going to come straight around, buzzing overhead, wanting to hold a funeral with you starring as a sacrificial victim. So, beginnings of wisdom is when you learn never to shoot at policemen, or never to argue with policemen. And Such Is Life was Ned Kelly's last quote, which is probably why Joseph Furphy used it as the title for his book, Such Is Life. And here I'll make a final closing point about this Hicks Watercart, which is standing in for a Furphy because I can't get a hold of a Furphy to show to you. You can see by the sprinkler cans at the bottom of the water outflow pipe, this was actually for watering dirt roads. It was used by the Glen Innes 7 Council, or maybe the 7 Shire Council, but this was a road builder's water cart. It was not actually for watering domestic livestock. Although, back in the day, if you had one of these on your farm and there was a drought, it meant that you could keep your sheep alive, you could cook, you could wash, you could have a bath, you could keep the whole thing going for months and months and months by going down to the creek once or twice a week and bringing home a ton of water in your Furphy water cart. Personally, I first encountered Such Is Life in 1992 after I'd broken my foot. With not much mobility, I spent a lot of time reading, and one of the things I read was Times House's collection of Australia's greatest books, and I encountered Such Is Life there. Possibly because my father was a 1909 edition and I'm a 1961 edition. My grandfather was 1885, sorry. He was a wheelwright and woodsman, and he worked for blacksmiths, and he had a close association with all kinds of bullock drivers. So for me, reading Such Is Life was kind of like a window into my grandfather's boyhood, you know, the world that he grew up in. It's one of the reasons that I think and speak and sometimes text in old colonial vernacular laced with strine. I really enjoy the style and the flavour of Such Is Life. It gives you a window into a vanished Australia back before the topsoil fell off the landscape, or when it was just falling off. Back before the rainfall had actually finished dropping. You know, you cut the forest down and the rainfall drops by 60% and it stabilises 60 years after you finish clearing the forest. All that was only just sort of in its early stages when Such Is Life was being written. I can thoroughly recommend it to anybody who wants to understand where the Australian gestalt is now. You have to look at where it came from, and this will show you where it came from. This will explain to you what the Euro peons from the British Isles thought they were doing when they came out here, and gives you a window into their prejudices and their perceptions and how they lived their lives, what they thought was quite reasonable, what they were trying to do, how they were trying to do it. And yeah, it's not an easy book to read, but it's highly rewarding. That's a Furphy. A long, complicated moral story with a really good meaning, buried in among the details. And the details are all fascinating, and you have to get them all straight in your head, otherwise you just get a shallow impression rather than a full understanding. So, Warbles on what to YouTube. Now you've got some serious, significant idea of what a Furphy is and what a Furphy is not. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.